Hello,
Yes.
everybody, and welcome to the first Upjet SIG meeting. So I'm going to get straight into kind of like just the purpose of and scope of the SIG. We at Upbound, we've been driving the development of Upjet specifically for our own needs of our providers. And then last year at Crossplane Day, we made the announcement that we're donating it and our providers back to the Crossplane community. And we finally made that a reality where we've moved all of the things into the Crossplane repos, and we've noticed over time a lot of the community have started using Upjet as well for the developing their own providers, and those who use the Upjet based providers like provider AWS and GCP and so on, are getting a little bit more involved than they used to before in the technical details of Upjet. Jonathan, you've made a few contributions already, and so on, and we felt like the time was right to start being a little bit more open about our plans. We've recently kind of like met as a team and discussed what we want to do over the next couple of months to improve the tooling further, and Alper will cover a little bit more of that after me. But we're here where we basically want to be a little bit more open, more transparent with what we're doing, make sure we hear from folks in the community who make proposals, um, excuse me, and ensure that we have alignment on the direction we're pushing things forward to, all for the benefit of the community. So in terms of this meeting, we'll probably focus mostly on Upjet and the impact it has on all the Upjet-based providers. But I think it's fairly reasonable to talk about any specific Upjet-based provider in here as well. Whether that's a provider AWS or whatever provider somebody is building with it. To this is a kind of like anything Upjet related. I think is fair game for this discussion. And by default, we'll look to cover kind of like big issues or PRs that introduce changes or propose changes. Make sure that we cover those. And Jonathan, we've got yours on here, and we've got Matt's issue here as well that we can get through today. But before we do that, I was thinking, Alper can give us a quick run through around things that the team has already been thinking about and what the impact of that might be going forward. So, Alper, do you want to take it away and just give an overview of what we're planning on tackling? At least what we can obviously change this with input from the community, but without additional input, this is what we were going to be focusing on.
Yes, thank you, John, for the introduction. So we have dumped our roadmap that's currently in our minds. It's not, very detailed, but we try to categorize it, according to, the broader topics that these items are related to. So we have a bunch of items for improving documentation. We have another bunch for improving observability. This also includes certain tasks in specific providers. But for the object-based providers, we'd like to introduce some common observability functionalities in the framework itself. Another category is related to improving the API quality. So we would like to improve the generated APIs from Upjet. Another category is we have recently visited Upjet's code generation pipelines while introducing CRD, multi-version CRD support. And, we have some recent fresh observations from there. And we also have some long-running issues regarding our code generation pipelines. So we would like to also work on improving the code generation pipelines of Upjet. And there are also some technical debt that we like to pay off. So I don't know if we should go into the details of each items here? How are you folks feeling about it?
I think if we can cover it at a high level, and if anybody has any questions, we can go into a little bit more details, probably best than going into detail explicitly on each one.
Okay. So, regarding documentation improvements, one of the items is that recently we have contributed new features to Upjet, but we haven't yet documented them. We have added some new configuration APIs, and we have added some new features, etc. And we haven't even reflected a subset of these new features, etc., to the template repository. So part of this is improving the object documentation, making it complete, and another aspect is also maintaining the template repository. This could also, in theory, include certain things like running some tests in the template repository or in the object repository itself, so that when we introduce some new changes, we make sure they are backwards compatible. People won't have to change, the API calls that they make to Upjet. Another thing related to this is we would like to also generate documentation for cross-resource references. Currently, we just document that it's a cross-resource reference, and they have label selectors and also references and also the target fields. So we generate 3 fields for cross-resource references, but it might be missing for the community, for the users of our APIs, that those 3 fields are related and things like that. So we would like to introduce the documentation, the doc comments that we generate for the cross-resource reference fields. The third item here is, I think this is a really important one. As you know, Crossplane managed resources have the notion of connection details, secrets, and in those secrets you will find a bunch of keys which correspond to the connection details that you are going to use to interact with the external resource, such as a database's URL, the admin username and password, and things like that all go into these connection details secrets. Currently, you need to go into the code or give the managed resource a try to see, what's there available for a managed resource in the connection details secret. We would like to also be able to generate, documentation for the available connection details secret keys. At least the
So
keys, probably the values.
let us quickly pause there. Does anybody have any other input around areas of documentation that should be improved for object-based providers or Upjet itself?
I think the external name configuration is a really big one. Right now, as a user of, say, provider AWS, if I want to observe a resource, depending on the resource kind, I either have to do nothing. I have to put like the ARN or something reasonably discoverable in the external name field, but I don't know that that's what I need to put, or I need to put something else in there. We don't currently have any way of providing documentation for the external name field because it's an annotation. And what is the format of what should be expected in there?
Yeah, so I completely agree. This is also something missing. And regarding the, Upjet-based official providers that we have, this is also part of our roadmap. We also need to document the external name syntax, what's expected when you are trying to import a resource, right. Expected when you're provisioning a resource.
I'd like to be able to get more resources to not use just from provider when that's not necessary. because then you can, then the manifest for an observed resource is the same as a manifest for a full control resource other than the management policy.
Yeah.
If we
So
can,
the challenge here is I didn't include it, that aspect in Upjet roadmap because those configurations are provider specific and they are not things that are generated by Upjet. That's why I didn't include it here. But this is an important topic to discuss. I agree.
I guess the like, how can Upjet help with this angle would be providing a common shared documentation mechanism that the providers can hook into. And then I think maybe not. The other thing that I kind of want to discuss at some point is
Matt, I cannot hear you anymore.
It seems like we lost Matt there. All right, we'll come back to him if he catches the connection again.
On the external name topic, so one thing we've noticed is that especially around cross-resource references resolving, there can be some quite interesting interactions with external name, and GCP's behavior around external name is maybe less consistent than Upjet assumes, and it would be good to have a way to, I guess, make that more consistent in Upjet. So a typical example is that the external name for a node pool in a GKE cluster contains cluster ID, project ID, and location. But the cluster field on the node pool can either be just the cluster ID, or if it's been resolved by the cross-resource reference, it more likely contains the full external name of the cluster, which means that it already contains the project ID, location, and cluster name. And so that then gets turned into an external name for the node pool, which is not valid for the Terraform provider.
Yeah, so
I don't know if that's something that I should expect Upjet to have a mechanism for fixing, maybe in the resolver, or whether.
So sorry. So the the resolver implementation involves extractor. So it observes the target managed resource and it constructs a string for the reference field. So that implementation is part of the provider itself. And if you especially look at provider AWS, there are many custom functions, preparing the correct syntax required by the target field. But I do remember, one of my colleagues, Sergen, was involved in provider GCP development, as well as, of course, other official providers. But he was also mentioning this variety of syntaxes in GCP. What I hear from him telling me that, GCP accepts a bunch of syntaxes, either it can be a short one or, a canonical one, as you described. And this also causes, external name changes. You start with one syntax and either after you import it, if import a resource, or, after a provider restart, etc., it may turn out to be a larger one. There is also an associated issue in Uptest related to this. In Uptest, we have import tests, and if the ID or if the syntax of this external name changes during a resource import, currently Uptest cannot handle this. I think it is also related to the issue that you are describing.
I fixed that issue.
Sorry.
I think I fixed that issue. I added an annotation to uptest that allows you to skip the import step for a particular resource. Maybe maybe a workaround is a better name than fix, but
yes, that's the idea. So you added the ability to skip import tests in those situations, but we had to have a control mechanism because uptest way of. So uptest just records the external name, and after an import, it compares it. But if the syntaxes do not match,
I think it's the Terraform ID that it records.
Yeah, but
not
we
the
extract the external name from the Terraform ID.
Right. So if the ID is the same, then therefore unless someone did something truly pathological like merge a random non-deterministic extractor into the provider, which would hopefully get rejected at the code review stage.
Yeah, so Jonathan, I think we need to look into the specifics of provider GCP for further discussions and specifics of the resources there.
My instinct is that what the behavior you described can probably be fixed by just changing the extractor function in the config directory in the provider. But I wouldn't know without looking at it in more detail.
Cool. I'll have a look. There's also some interesting cases in provider GCP, well, in GCP, where some of the fields in the external name are basically optional and should default to empty string, which is somewhat novel.
Anyway, Jonathan, did you hit any bugs related to this?
Yes, import typically fails. Well, import doesn't. Eventually, it sort of sorts itself out. But if the external resource already exists, it tends to have interesting side effects. But once there's, if it manages to create it, then eventually settles down because it puts the correct ID into the MR.
Okay, so
but if you're trying to create an MR for an existing resource, it will fail the import and often get stuck in interesting states.
Okay, so that's also, my general knowledge about this topic. So at some point, the syntax is settled down and, the resource is synced and ready. But if this is broken for a specific managed resource, etc., we definitely need to, look into that immediately. Should I continue?
Yeah, are we happy to move on from documentation improvements? Let's move quickly, otherwise we're gonna rapidly run out of time. So I'll maybe cover this one. We're already working on adding API call counters for the providers. We've James on the call, and he's been working on it for provider AWS, and that will hopefully see the light of day this week or next. And we'll move forward with doing that for the other ones that Upbound works on, the GCP and Azure as well. Are there any other immediate kind of like considerations or thoughts around improved observability that folks want to highlight here? All right, let's move on. Alper, I'm going to hand over to you on the API quality one, because this is definitely above my pay grade. You tell them about this stuff.
Yeah, thank you. So the first item in the list is we recently had a discussion around this with Jonathan on a PR he opened in Upjet. So it's about, currently we generate singleton lists, so lists with just one element. This is related to the representation, the HCL representation of these Terraform resources. It's related to the HCL configuration syntax, but it's reflected in our APIs, and it's a source of confusion. There is an old issue that I referenced here, which, you know, suggests that we generate, you know, these singleton lists as embedded objects. And recently, we also worked on server-side apply, merge strategies, etc. And this topic came out of that discussion also, because if we generate these singleton lists as embedded objects, then the default merge strategy will just do good, and we will not need to do, you know, list map merge strategy configuration, which is troublesome, but I won't go into the details of that. And you know, this changed, like, you know, if we just start generating these singleton lists as embedded objects, it will also help with us with the SSA merge configuration. So
I'm wondering, Alper, maybe it's worth standing still on this topic, since Jonathan has a PR open for it and we did have it on the backlog to discuss. I want to make sure we utilize the time today to touch on this one, and maybe it's worth just standing still. And I know you and I talked about this earlier this week. Maybe you can share some of your thoughts on this.
yeah, so I think we have alignment with Jonathan regarding this. I'm okay with this solution Jonathan proposed, let's say, as a workaround. But, you know, if you prioritize this conversion, like, you know, then we will not need to do this. So it was, I think the discussion was around the priorities and, you know, the expected timeline that we can bring this conversion. So previously, we didn't attack this problem because we didn't have support for conversion hooks. And you know, as you would expect, you know, converting each and every singleton list into an embedded object, you know, is a huge API change set. But right now we should be able to convert the old and the new APIs automatically for our users. So the barrier for implementing this change is low right now. And that's why we decided to, you know, include this in our roadmap.
I think, you know, one thing to maybe ask you, Jonathan, is, do you have time sensitivity, you know, on getting this landed and unblocking you on something? If we were to kind of like go with implementing the more sustainable longer term solution, you know, we would probably look at a week or two to get that out. Does that match your expectations here? I mean, if there's a time sensitive thing and this is blocking you, you know, we'd be happy to accept and merge it and go ahead with it for now.
So this has caused various issues with sort of flakiness creating external resources. However, when that's come up, what we, I guess, can do is just manually add the, individually add the merge configuration, which is what we've been doing up till now. So there's a couple of PRs against provider GCP to basically set the merge strategy on individual resources where we've run into this. And as a workaround, that works fine. So if it's still going to be a few weeks, I guess I'm happy to just keep adding individual merge strategies whenever we find a specific problem, while we wait for the embedding of the objects, which I think is a much better solution.
My only concern, so one thing that my team is doing, probably maybe more than would be expected, is I have a lot of developers with very little Crossplane experience who are translating Terraform HCL into Crossplane managed resource manifests. And this is in most cases
straightforward, and like the changing the singleton lists to objects would make that much more intuitive, and it would also break the like robotic, this is definitely how you do it, you can just read ACL, and once you know the counterintuitive rules, now you can apply it, because sometimes a block would be an object and sometimes it would be an array. On balance, I still think it's worth doing, and making it more intuitive in most cases is a greater benefit than losing that, like, once you know these confusing rules, you can just do it. But it's not 100%. It's like, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's not just 1 step forward.
Yeah, so I don't know. So the thing regarding these singleton lists is semantically they are embedded objects, either optional or required embedded objects. So I think we are leaking, you know, some constraints coming from how HCL configuration syntax is represented into our, API. So I think, the older issue discusses this aspect. It's not related to server-side API merges. As I mentioned, it's relatively a new topic. But I think, the real motivation here is not, making server-side API merges easier, but it's more like, improving our APIs so that, it reflects the semantic meaning of those fields.
The #1 piece of advice I give developers writing Crossplane managed resource manifests for the first time is that tiny little field in the documentation that either says array or object and is really easy to overlook. Don't overlook it.
Yeah. So in fact, we also have example code generation pipelines in Upjet. Currently we use them to generate example manifests, scrape the Terraform registry and generate example manifests, etc.
So those would need to be updated.
So when we update the code generation pipelines, it will automatically be reflected. So when you look at the generated example manifests, you will see that the singleton lists are no longer lists, but they have been turned into embedded objects. I think this should also help in the transition period. And also, I'd like to also mention, I think we have an item for this, but for these singleton lists, unfortunately, we are also not generating the CRD validation rules also. So although these are singleton lists, at the API server level, we will just allow lists of length longer than 1, right?
Oh, so we're ignoring the max items from the Terraform schema?
So they will fail at runtime, when we try to pass that list, which violates Terraform's, max items constraint. Terraform layer will complain about it. So I don't know if I have mentioned it here, but this is also something that we would like to improve. But of course, if we turn these embedded lists singleton lists into embedded objects, then the, CRD validation will no longer be relevant, although we will still be keeping the old APIs, and, in those APIs, we can introduce this, these CRD validation rules. That's why I mentioned it. So the second item, are we okay with this item, or do we need any further discussions?
I mean, as I said, I'm happy if the timeline's weeks rather than months, then I'm happy enough to close this PR.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
Jonathan,
I won't publicly state Alper's timeline so that he's not held to it, but it's a matter of maybe 1 or 2 weeks to get the work in. But as we all know, things sometimes go awry based on what you think will happen. But we're happy to prioritize it because it's something that's been a pain point for a long time, and we want to address this properly going forward. we did feel bad for the fact that you created a PR with all of these things, Jonathan, and it was like, yeah, that's not a great experience. But like if you're okay with
I
it,
half
like
expected that to happen. So it was good to get it discussed. And I didn't know
well,
that what it was doing
at a
was
minimum, you prioritize this
definitely a
work for us. So
workaround.
Yeah, so this was also one of the motivations of this meeting. Like, if we exchange ideas, the directions we would like to move on, etc. And if we have alignment on these things, it will be a coordinated effort and much more effective. So,
all right. We've got about 10 minutes left, so let's rush through the last few ones very quickly.
yeah, so don't say me to rush. It's something that I cannot personally do. So, there are a bunch of items. Let me try. I'll try my best. Yeah. So there are a bunch of items regarding cell rule generation. I think this is one of the things, that will vastly improve, and that's disturbing the user experience around our APIs. One of them is CRD validation rule generation for immutable fields. So we have some missing, aspects here. Another item is, generating cross-resource CRD validation rules for cross-resource reference fields. If the target field is, a required field, currently we generate it as an optional field if it's a cross-resource reference, but at least one of the fields should have been supplied. Users in our community have encountered bugs because of this. They just didn't supply, required field values because they're cross-resource reference and things like that. We would like to also implement certain features in Upjet so that we will have better support for API deprecation. So either we may want to deprecate APIs that we introduce, or we can detect that certain APIs are already deprecated at the Terraform layer, and we would like to surface this because with the next, Terraform provider bump, maybe that API will be removed, and users of our APIs are currently not prepared for this because they're not aware that an API has already been deprecated at the Terraform layer. So we would like to surface the information already available there. Another thing is, this is again an old issue. We had, improved how you define cross-resource references. There's a new field for doing this with better semantics and more robust. We would like to deprecate the old type API in favor of the Terraform name, and make the transition in the object-based providers. There are also a bunch of improvements that we would like to do regarding late initialization. So these late initialization related bugs, make up the category of common issues that our users encounter. There are some workarounds currently in use, like you can configure the manage resource to exclude certain fields during late initialization. We would like to make this conditional so that you can define mutually exclusive fields. If field A has a value, then field B is not late initialized, or vice versa, and things like that. So we would like to be able to define conditional late initialization configuration. There are a bunch of other improvements that we would like to make here. We also have some information already available at the Terraform layer at the native schema, and we would like to also generate the late initialization configuration out of the schema. So Terraform already has a notion of mutually exclusive fields, for example. Why don't we just generate the configuration automatically and You don't need to configure the late initialization library for these mutually exclusive fields. Let me also briefly talk about the code generation pipeline changes. So currently the code generation pipeline is more or less a monolithic pipeline, meaning that, you know, it has some sub-steps, and, you know, this, you know, the next step depends on the output of the previous step. And, you know, this is in the definition of a pipeline, of course, but unfortunately, data is passed via memory. So during runtime between these pipeline steps, if we just improve our code generation pipelines so that they can get the previous steps input from the file system, from the already generated files, then this will allow us to run a specific step directly without requiring running the previous steps. So I think this has become already a necessity for a long time, especially for provider AWS and provider Azure, the make generate command. Yeah, I see. So it's taking ages.
My workflow is run make generate and then go make coffee and then come back, and usually I'm done making coffee before make is done generating the provider.
Yep, same.
Yeah. We feel your pain. And, you know,
the fact that this is something that like necessarily runs on all the developers' machines means that I know you, like, you, of course you feel the pain, and that like makes it, you know, better incentive to get it, make it better.
Yeah.
Can we also use, it seems like I loved your description of like passing things in memory and changing that to passing via file system so that we can reuse things. It seems like makefile syntax is kind of designed for that sort of workflow of this step outputs those files, and if the dependents have changed, then I need to rerun it, and if not, I don't need to run it. Do you think it would be viable to make the makefile smart enough to know which steps need to be rerun when, so the user experience can still just be run make generate, and sometimes it's fast and sometimes it's slow?
So, you know, this object code generation pipeline is invoked in the official providers or in the template repository via go generate. You can find, you know, the file api/generate.go, and then you will see the point where we invoke the objects code generation pipeline. So makefile is not aware of that step. Go handles it by, you know, the generate tool. And, you know, what we do there is we invoke a binary from the provider repository. It's generally under by convention cmd/generate/main.go. And what it does is it composes, you know, the object code generation pipeline. It configures it and invokes it. So that's how it works. I can share the details offline. But, you know, the thing is, currently Upjet expects the pipeline steps to be running parallel sequentially. So what we are trying to, you know, break here is that, you know, that interdependency between the pipeline steps, and, you know, we should be able to just run them. There have been a couple of other things, but we will just run out of time, and I won't go into details. We had better open issues for these individual items and, you know, have discussions, you know, there. And the last item is, you know, paying off technical debt. There are probably other things that we can add here, but, you know, as a selection, let's say, an important, you know, category here is, especially GEM was involved in implementing the spec.init provider API, its interaction with the spec for provider API, etc., in the context of the recent, as we call them, no fork architecture changes. So in the architecture changes where we left off forking the Terraform CLI and directly statically link the Terraform provider's code. So Jem was involved and he identified a bunch of issues. We had lots of discussions on various improvements that we can make regarding this spec init provider API, etc. Jem also opened a bunch of bugs, and I know Matt also has recently opened an issue regarding this topic. And you know, there's also a core crossplane issue where we track the graduation of the management policies feature. It's currently beta. So in the context of these issues, you know, some parts and bugs will be implemented, fixed in Upjet. And, you know, we would like to also prioritize and, you know, this topic. There are also a bunch of sporadic bugs that we are aware of, for example, in our tests, etc. We would like to also address them in near term. So
You made it, Alper, with 1 minute to spare. I wanted to, like, I don't know if folks need to jump off here, like we're officially at time, but you know, we haven't gotten to your issue yet, Matt. If you wanted to maybe verbalize some of this here on the call.
Yeah. So I think my motivation here is largely driven by wanting to make it easier to normalize external names. At the moment, I feel like most improvements to external name configurations result in identifying new, this actually was an identifier field all along, but we didn't mark it as such. And then that gets removed from spec.init provider, which is technically a breaking change, even though it never would have really worked there. I think it makes sense to not have those fields in spec.init provider because there's not really any value there. But I think a related discussion is how do we want to define a breaking change that we consider unacceptable to release in a minor version versus like this is just a bug fix, and yes, it breaks. It's a schema. The schema is incompatible, but the old version of the schema didn't really work, or the field we're changing, you know, wasn't used for anything. I feel like that's more of a like management policy, like organizational, what's our policy, not management policy as in the Crossplane feature discussion.
Yeah, I'll share with you. Whenever I hear breaking changes, like my hairs rise because we've got customers who are really sensitive to any breaking change. And I've got our customer success team on my case whenever we talk about this.
So maybe maybe we need a different word. because like really I feel like this is like, if you want to technically say like, is every instance of the old schema going to be valid? Is it possible to have an old resource that would be valid under the new version? The answer is yes. And if the question is a much more practical one of, is there anything that anybody would reasonably have been doing and it would have worked, and now it's going to not work? Now the answer to that is going to be no. And so I feel like that's what makes it a breaking change that's not a breaking change. But that's not like, that is a level of nuance that is not available in the breaking change yes or no.
Yeah. You know, that's something that you need to massage the messaging.
Exactly. And
almost like prepare the ground ahead of time with folks. I think, you know, this is something, at least from our side, we'd want to test with our solution architects and maybe see what their ideas are around how customers would respond to this.
Great.
You know, like the only kind of like hesitancy I have is we just did a major version release on all the providers, and I would be hesitant to go to a V2 so quickly. But if we can position this as not actually a breaking change, so to speak, yeah, that could be stomached in a minor version release.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I mean, for one thing we could do is we could release a tool that just goes and crawls the manifest. You can just point this at a cluster and like crawls the manifest of every managed restart in the cluster and says, are you setting spec.init provider dot any of the fields that we just removed? And if so, you should probably not be doing that. And you can fix that and know that it's going to be a problem. And if not, then you can just apply this upgrade and it's safe. So it's like maybe the one way to massage it is it's a mitigated breaking change.
Yeah, that does soften the blow often. For some, it doesn't. But yeah, Alper, you have any thoughts on this?
Startup with enterprise customers is like the worst of both worlds.
Yes.
Yeah, so regarding the breaking changes, there are a bunch of tools that can help us here, and one of them is the migration tooling, the client-side migration tooling, which can handle this sort of the kind of changes that we are discussing here, by the way. But the migration tooling is designed to be run out of band, like it's not invoked by the conversion webhooks or something like that. You need to manually run the migration tooling as a client of your Kubernetes cluster. But what I'd like to mention about this suggestion and the general spec init provider API is we have some deeper discussions that we would like to make. So, Jem, are you willing to contribute here so that people hear a different voice also?
Yeah, sure, Alper. While moving on to the no-fork architecture, I implemented the merging of init provider and for provider fields, and discovered that there are many edge cases that are very difficult to handle or even impossible to handle. Because in some of those cases, Terraform reports some diff, and we have to determine if that diff is because of a difference in the init provider fields or for provider fields or both, and decide whether to overwrite that diff or not. And given that these concerns might be limiting to might be limiting us in the future maintenance of the providers, I would like to introduce propose some changes to init provider API, so that before going to GA we have a more maintainable design for providers. And I bet it would be great if we could consider Matt's proposal here and mine at the same time, so that we can address concerns of both and decide what to do with init provider accordingly. I have some questions to Matt if we are not running too much over time. I'm interested with why he tells in the first breaking change item here that it would be strange for someone to be setting an immutable field in init provider, because that sounds to me something that people can do.
I guess my perspective is, at least my mental model of what is init provider for is, it is in many ways a crossplane analog, not a direct analog of Terraform ignore changes. And there would be no reason to set ignore changes on a field that cannot change.
Got it. It makes sense. But it's not just ignore changes, but when we can use init provider to specify some fields during the creation, and that are supposed to be immutable after the creation. So when we would like to specify some of those immutable fields during the creation phase, in that case, we would like to put them in the init provider.
Because if we put them in for provider, they would not be specified during the creation phase?
They would be specified, but I mean, the reason we put them in init provider is most likely because they may cause race condition with external controllers. For instance, consider an auto-scaling group in AWS and consider its desired size. Perhaps it is controlled by AWS so that it can auto-scale. If we had put it inside the for provider, it would race with AWS's desired size. Therefore, we put it in the init provider, for instance.
That seems like it fits completely inside my ignore changes mental model and would be a mutable field. Do you have an immutable example?
I don't have an example at hand, but I'm afraid users are not considering whether init provider or for provider would be a better place for that job. But judging by the definition of init provider, they just think, oh, okay, I can put it there, so why not put it there?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's it. I think that's a valid perspective. It's just not one that I was thinking of.
Okay.
Yeah, one
Indeed,
comment
that's
from
why
me.
that's why I would like to discuss the role of init provider from a broader perspective, so
Okay.
that its purpose reflects more of its use.
Yeah, Matt, regarding the analogy you drew with Terraform's ignore changes and, you know, Crossplane's init provider, what Terraform has is, you know, what I call as a, you know, differential API. So you declare something, but you'd like to exclude certain things that are declared in ignore changes. What we do with init provider is the opposite. It's an aggregation API. So we merge init provider together with for provider to calculate the desired state. However, this only holds true for creation, for resource creation. So for example, if you are updating an external resource, then we need to filter out any changes coming from spec init provider changes. So that's what makes implementing the API semantics really difficult and, you know, troublesome.
Oh, so when we're running like a Terraform plan or the equivalent in API world,
yeah,
we are running that with the product of merging for provider and init provider every time. And then we are then like dissecting that observed diff to try and figure out what came from a init provider, and if it came from a init provider, they'd remove it from the diff.
Yes,
and this is the surgery problem that Jem mentioned is in between very hard and sometimes actually impossible.
Exactly. And when you look
Got
at
it.
from this perspective, what's confused both me and Jem was, I think it makes perfect sense for spec init provider to be immutable. Because, you know, if we are going to ignore any changes coming from spec init provider, then why do we allow changes to spec init provider in the first place?
From a like CRD perspective,
yeah, so we
those fields should be immutable.
reject them at the API server level by a CRD validation rule. And you know, coming from this angle, what you wrote confused us. So that's why, you know, Jem was asking you.
I think that makes sense. I'm glad I was able to explain that. I would say one change that it makes sense that spec.init provider would be mostly immutable, but I would want the ability to maybe actually it would be like if the ID is defined, then you can't add new fields to it. And but you can always remove fields from it. Like the one change that would make sense to make to an existing resources init provider is to say, like, I want to start specifying this field in the spec for provider, or I want to stop specifying this field entirely and let it late initialize, which could be accomplished by changing a field to null in init provider. That seems like that would be reasonable. But other than that, I totally agree that, like, why would you want to change something after the resource has already been created if it's only used during create?
So I think what you propose, like, makes sense. Like, we can decide. So another confusion point for us was, it looks like, identifier fields should be part of spec init provider. But it comes from how spec init provider API was first proposed. So it was proposed only to be considered during creates, external resource creates. And we need the identifier fields, for the other methods also. For example, if you are going to import or observe a resource, you need to specify only the identifier fields. And the original proposition comes that, originally spec init provider was proposed for the race condition that, Jem described. So let's say you have an autoscaler and, you don't want to step in. So you need to be able to specify a parameter when you are creating the resource, but then you should not be trying to reconcile that parameter. A good example.
That really does feel like the same idea as ignore changes, and I think that's even how it was implemented in the CLI forking, right?
Yeah, so that's where spec init provider comes from, and that's why we are not considering, spec provider as the sole place to specify identifier fields or immutable fields and things like that. So what I suggest here and what we discussed previously with Jem here is that we will open some issues and contribute to the graduation, issue, and we can continue these discussions there. Yeah.
Okay. I'm very curious to learn more about what sort of API changes you think would need to be made to the init provider gem. Is that something that is like you're still trying to figure out what sort of API would work for this, or is this something where you have you're still figuring it out? That's not surprising. It's complicated. Okay. So does it, but it sounds like what you're saying is that the previous semantics of spec init provider, or the previous behavior of, like, what does it do, that was implemented by adding an ignore changes block to the generated HCL, is not really something that can be supported in the API based architecture?
No, because we're not using Terraform CLI anymore. So,
and that's what parses
us anymore.
The Terraform CLI is what parses ignore changes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the surgery that you're trying to do with init provider is essentially the same as the surgery that the Terraform CLI is doing internally.
Yeah. So Jem has already implemented this surgery, by the way.
Okay.
Why we are, retelling this story is that, we had, observations while implementing these changes, and, had the mindset how to improve things, etc., while working on this. And, we would like to bring these ideas onto the table, especially, it's a good time to consider these things because we are planning to graduate and, make the granular management policies GA. That's why I would like to also get involved more.
That sounds good. So you basically, it sounds like the what you discovered while implementing the I guess what we're calling it surgery code now, was that you were able to do the same thing the Terraform CLI was doing. It's just that was an incomplete solution, and there were some problems that just couldn't be solved there in either the Upjet provider or the Terraform CLI, and it was just less of a problem for Terraform because of the differential API that Alper mentioned. It's just we're not routinely specifying all of these fields. It's just you can't put that in ignore changes, or if you put that in ignore changes, it won't work.
Yeah, I mean, if we had a differential API like ignore changes in Terraform, it would be easier to definitely get rid of the differences due to init provider. But because we don't, it complicates things a lot, and it is difficult to understand whether a change comes from a change to the init provider, which shouldn't have happened in the first place, or to the for provider, or externally. And now we have lots of cases, lots of edge cases to handle.
Or is one thing you're considering maybe introducing a differential API?
Yes, why not? I mean, yeah, that is also possible. If it's going to improve our users' experience, developer experience, why not? But I guess there could be simpler solutions like preventing any updates to init provider from the API server in the first place. Yeah, we are considering options, and we are open to any proposals.
Great. I think from a user perspective, a differential API might be intuitive. And it seems like that's a good, from that seems like that satisfies the high fidelity perspective. That if that's at the implementation level, that's ultimately what's going on, is it's based on the diff, then let's just say that in the API, and then that makes our lives easier and our code less likely to contain subtle bugs.
Yeah, so that was also one of the things we considered this differential API as a better alternative. By the way, this was already considered, so you can read the proposal, and the proposal initially proposed spec ignore changes sort of thing.
Oh, so, there was in the initial proposal for a net provider.
Yeah, I think the very first proposal was like that. I was not involved, unfortunately, but looks like there have been already some discussions there. So it's if you'd like to take a look at, you can read in core Crossplane repo under design folder. But I completely agree that the differential API is more declarative. So it's like, I declare something, but I also declare certain fields, parameters that I'd like to just ignore, changes in those parameters. And in the aggregation API that we are currently using, it's not declarative. It looks like it's declarative, but you need to at runtime figure out what to ignore and what not to, and what to include. If the change is coming exclusively from a spec init provider, update, then you need to filter that out. And this is not declarative. It looks like it's declarative, but it's not declaring what to exclude. And what's important here is what's to exclude.
Right. It looks good, but it doesn't do what it says on the tin.
Yeah, you need to implement it at runtime to make it perform its real job. Let's put it that way. And it's complicated. It's really complicated. And as Jem mentioned, there are some, cases, especially in the CLI-based implementation, we cannot even implement them using Terraform's ignore changes. Like, the Terraform's ignore changes is not expressive enough to filter out certain updates, let's say. So we could just be saying ignore changes from spec init provider, tags updates, for example, let's say. But in the current implementation, since we are trying to filter things out from the aggregated API, we need to, represent them. And, the, syntax is not expressive enough there.
That makes a lot of sense. Separate question. Are there plans to continue maintaining the CLI-based Upjet implementation?
Yes.
Yes. So the long-term vision for Upjet is that it has 3 ways to initialize Terraform resources: CLI
Yes.
plugin, CLI framework, and SDK.
Yes, definitely. So the CLI-based external client is still there. The external connector and external client are still there. And I expect, most of the providers are already, relying on that. But as you know, we have moved all the official providers
and removed the Terraform binary, which then shrunk the size of the Docker images in half, which I personally appreciate. I was building 24 sub providers for AWS from home and trying to upload them over my home internet connection, which only gives me 10 megabits up, and it took 2 hours. Like, I've got a really fast download pipe, but it's a cable modem and it doesn't let me upload quickly. So maybe this is just a USA problem, and in the rest of the world you have like actual modern symmetric internet connections. But over here, the residential uplink speeds suck. Okay, cool. That sounds good. I think we can discuss next time the like, it seems like that the like removing the immutable fields is sort of maybe should be, does it seem like the sort of change that should be made by itself? It sounds like not. It sounds like instead of removing immutable fields, we should just totally change the API of init provider.
Well, they are not mutually exclusive, that's for sure. But what I would like to do is to let's consider them together and decide what to do. Otherwise, we would be changing back and forth the API and introduce unnecessary complexity.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, what you propose makes sense in my opinion. We could choose to do that. But as you mentioned, we'd like to also consider some other things in relation to this. And let's look at how those discussions will go, and we will have some concrete items to implement at the end of those discussions.
Sounds good.
By the way, Matt, I linked the design documents related to init provider in the SIG Upjet document. You can see them there.
On the meeting agenda?
Yeah, in the agenda.
Thanks. Cool. Thank you very much for your time. I'm excited to meet you, Alper. I'm gonna have a fun time working with you.
Yeah, I am also excited to meet you. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
I loved your don't tell me to rush. I cannot do this. That's exactly how my brain works too. So that'll be fun.
And see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Next time. Goodbye.